we took an overnight trip to Haworth, which is in West Yorkshire. It's much, much different than London, which is busy city. This was a gloomy, rainy moor town with the moors are just this open expanse of land where nothing is growing, and you can see it all around. It's wet. While we were there, you could see we were under these heavy rain clouds, and it was raining and drizzling. And you could see that off in the distance. It wasn't like that. It was sunny. But under this town, it was completely dreary all the time. And that's a big part of their works. If you read any of the Bronte sisters, it heavily molds their writing.
So while we were staying at Haworth, we actually stayed at a youth hostel, which was my favorite part. So hostels, they're cheap and affordable for everyone, especially travelers. What happens is like 6 people wind up staying in a room. They're like bunked, and it's like the cutest thing ever. And there's like breakfast and everything's like home cooked, and it was just a lot of fun to go and see it.
You can see the dreary. You can see how it's completely covered in clouds, and all that you can see around are these giant expanses of moors. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Anne, and Emily.
The Bronte sisters were born and grew up in the town of Haworth in Yorkshire. Like she said, it's a very rainy, gloomy town, miles away from any other town. They grew up in the Haworth parsonage, which was run by their father, Patrick. After their mother died, Patrick didn't know what else to do, so he sent them away to school, where the 2 eldest children, Maria and Elizabeth, grew ill and died. The school, the clergy daughters' school at Cowan Bridge, was heavily influenced of Charlotte's most famous piece of work, Jane Eyre. Their older brother, Branwell, who at one point was seen as the most talented, unfortunately fell into a lifestyle of gambling, alcoholism, and addiction, and eventually died of tuberculosis.
We went to a pub where he used to have his own special chair. Branwell was, he was famous at the pub. He was a frequenter pretty much every day.
Living in the isolated town of Haworth forced the Bronte children into creating their own private and make-believe worlds, although the children created an extraordinarily detailed worlds that seemed to be above what could come out of a child's mind. These stories seem to become realities in the life and minds of the girls, and their strange and isolated behaviors as adults make us believe that these worlds became the girls' primary realities.
You can see in the pictures, their parsonage overlooked a cemetery. So if you can just picture these young girls living in an isolated place with a father who was questionably angry, and we don't exactly know how angry he was. This was their life every day. It was just them and their brother, overlooking this dreary cemetery with a town that was always rainy and always dreary and not very cheery.
And everything's brown, apparently.
Everything, yeah. But the girls eventually decided to publish some of their works under the androgynous pseudonyms Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell. They were not very well received at first and only sold 2 copies ever, and then they tried again. Charlotte with Jane Eyre, Emily with Wuthering Heights, and Anne with Agnes Grey in 1847. Their books were extremely controversial, but they grew extremely popular. They reflect the gloom of the moorland and the isolation they lived in. Emily eventually died in 1848, Anne in 1849, and then Charlotte just a few years later in 1855. And their father, Patrick, died in 1861, outliving his wife and all 6 of his children.
The pictures of the church that you saw were actually the town there was the original tower that was built. The church actually got burned down, I believe. Or
Demolished.
Demolished, yeah.
By,
They-
by Patrick Bronte's successor, Papa abolishing.
Okay, so one of our stops we went before Haworth was actually in London, which was to the Sherlock Holmes Museum, which is actually located at 221B Baker Street.
Which was like my favorite museum because I love Sherlock Holmes. So for everyone who doesn't know, Sherlock Holmes is a detective.
A fictional character.
Fictional character. Although he was portrayed so realistically that many people like really believe the stories.
Yeah, he was actually created by a Scottish author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and everyone knows Sherlock Holmes. He's famous for his deducing abilities, his logic, his reasoning, his cocaine addiction, his scope of observation, and his reasoning skills. And he's featured in 4 novels and 56 short stories. And most of these stories about Holmes is narrated by his sidekick, Watson. We know a lot about his earlier life, not Doyle's, actually Sherlock Holmes, because people really did believe that he was so real because of the descriptions. He went to Cambridge. He lived at 221B Baker Street. His habitual drug use, his attraction to Irene Adler, which if you all saw the new Sherlock Holmes movie, is the main female lead. What was interesting about the museum is that it actually emphasized this idea that Sherlock Holmes was real. The Victorian home was decorated with his relics, his pipes, his hat, things like that, where it actually wasn't any of Doyle stuff. It made it look like Sherlock Holmes actually lived in the house. So he became a very real character. And we actually had a lot of fun. There were lots of mannequins that portrayed all the different stories.
It was really interesting to see how like they like put so much effort into replicating everything. Like his bedroom, his house was completely replicated. It was really cool to see like the artifacts try to be remade. We have a short video actually about it's really short, but
It's about our presentation. It's only like a minute long, but it shows Haworth, a short clip of it, and then into the Sherlock Holmes Museum. And it shows that we really did have a lot of fun on our trip, even though we integrated that with learning about the different places.
well, that's really sad. It was a really cute video.
Yeah.
It was really funny actually, but anyway. Well, I just wanted to sum up like a couple of things about our trip real quick because we did have a lot of free time as well as learning, going to museums and stuff. We got to see a lot of really cool things. We did go see Oliver Twist, their Broadway version of it. It was really good actually. It was the musical. We went to Westminster Abbey where the coronations are done with the kings and queens. And then we all got to do our own thing during the day. So we went to the Eye of London, which is a huge Ferris wheel of London, and like it gets to oversee like the entire London. We saw Big Ben. For Harry Potter fans, we went to go see Platform 9 3/4, which was like really awesome for me. Then we saw the Tower of London where they have the crown jewels, and that was really interesting. They actually have such like, it's like the highest security point in all of London, and the crown jewels are so like protected that you're not allowed to stand in front of them. So like what happens is you like step on like this conveyor belt and it moves you along because it doesn't want you to stay in one place too long. And like that was really interesting. And then we got to see all the scepters and like the crowns, and Westminster Abbey was really cool. All the people that are buried there, really important people, authors, poets. Yeah. But London was so much fun. Fish and chips, if you ever go to London, you should go get them. They're great. Saw London Bridge.
We fit so much into that 2
2-day period.
What I really liked about our trip to